All right, hi everyone, I'm Steve Levitsky. I'm director of the Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies here at Harvard. Welcome back to Dr. Class Tuesday webinar. I want to begin by introducing my awesome co-chair, high off the Red Sox victory last night, Fernandez.
Welcome everyone.
And I also want to thank our awesome Dr. Class staff of Pau Ibarra and Jillian Scales and Gabrielle Patterson. These are the folks who make this and every other Dr. Class event actually possible. Many thanks to them. Just a few housekeeping items before we jump in. First of all, Spanish language translation is available for this event. So if you want to hear the discussion in Spanish, just go to the interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And now I'm realizing that if anyone really needs translation, they probably didn't understand what I said in English. But secondly, we will be recording the webinar today as we always do. It'll be available afterwards on the Dr. Class YouTube channel, not long after today's session. And third, and importantly, if you've got a question for any of the panelists today, we want to hear them, or at least we want to read them. Send them not through the chat, which is shut down, but send your questions through the Q&A function. And after the presentations, we'll have a period of Q&A where Fran and I will be relating the questions onto the panelists. So feel free to submit your questions at any point during the panel, and Fran and I will make sure that we get to them. We have an outstanding panel for you today. As all of you know, social and cultural norms have changed dramatically in Latin America in recent years. The region is a lot less religious than it used to be. The influence of the Catholic Church has waned considerably. The days of thinking about Latin America as homogeneously Catholic are long gone. And we've seen the rise in recent decades of demands for a variety of new social rights, from women's rights to LGBT rights to indigenous and Afro-Latin American rights. And in several countries, the expansion of these rights not only has been pretty significant, but has led or triggered to a conservative reaction, often led by a diversity of religious groups, Catholic and non-Catholic. And one very important area of contestation in many countries in the region, from Central America down to Argentina, has been abortion rights. And we're really fortunate to have with us today three outstanding scholars of abortion politics in Latin America. I want to just introduce each of them up front, and then each will speak for about 12 minutes or so, and that should leave us with 30 or 40 minutes for Q&A at the end. And Fran and I will, as I said, take the questions and feed them to the panelists. We'll close at 1:20 or 1:25. It's an honor to introduce our three panelists today. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will speak. So first of all, Camilla Reuterswärd is a research fellow at the Institute for Development Studies at the University of Sussex. She's a political scientist with a PhD from the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and her research focuses broadly on gender and politics with an emphasis on public policy in the Global South. Her research explores broad questions about when, why, and how policies that benefit marginalized groups, in particular women and LGBTQ plus communities, come about. Her work centers primarily on the politics of abortion and same-sex policy in Latin America and the factors that facilitate or obstruct change in a liberalizing direction. Her book project, Party Politics, the Catholic Church and Social Movements, the Politics of Abortion and Same-Sex Marriage in Mexico, examines the puzzle of Mexico's uneven subnational policy reforms in the area of moral gender policy. Camilla's current projects focus on conservative mobilization and the dynamics of religious institutions' impact on gender policy, including on areas of sexual education and transgender legislation. Welcome, Dr. Reuterswärd. We are thrilled to have you with us. Our second speaker will be Cora Fernandez Anderson. She's assistant professor of politics at Mount Holyoke College. Her research explores social mobilization as a possible path towards social change. She's worked on movements demanding justice for human rights, as well as movements to decriminalize abortion, particularly in the Southern Cone. Her book, Fighting for Abortion Rights in Latin America, Social Movements, State Allies, and Institutions, which came out last year, I think, explores abortion reform, the politics of abortion reform in Uruguay, Chile, and Argentina. I gotta say that is a pretty timely book. The book focuses on the role that alliances between civil society actors and sympathetic allies in the state have played in the struggle for the legalization of abortion. We'll hear about that today, I think. So welcome, Professor Fernandez Anderson. And finally, our own Jocelyn Viterna is professor of sociology here at Harvard. She's co-chair of the Central America program at Dr. Class. Most of you know Jocelyn very well. Her research examines how social mobilization affects gender norms and practices in politics, in state institutions, in warfare, and in local communities. Her book, Women in War, The Microprocesses of Mobilization in El Salvador, won 4, count them, 4 major book awards. It's a really great book, and I recommend it to you. And Jocelyn is currently involved in several different research projects, primarily related to women in politics in Central America. One project documents how activism surrounding women's sexual and reproductive rights have affected or transformed the Salvadoran judicial system, and specifically its processes for litigating gender. A second project examines how Salvadoran OBGYNs care for pregnant women and fetuses while dealing with the nation's incredibly draconian and absolute abortion ban. The project also looked at the ban's consequences for women and fetal health. And a third project compares the discourse and tactics of 8 conservative and 8 progressive social movements in the United States, investigating whether and how each camp strategically mobilizes the concept or the notion of gender. Viterna's work has been published in most of the top journals in her field, including the American Journal of Sociology, the American Sociological Review, Politics and Gender, and the Latin American Research Review. Welcome back, Professor Viterna. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. Okay, so we start with Camilla. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Steve. And hi, everyone. It's great to be here, and I much look forward to our conversation today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I hope everyone can see that. Okay, great. So my presentation today will focus on abortion politics in Mexico, which is where I've done most of my research. And I think recent developments also make it a particularly interesting case for us to discuss today. I think I might be, one second. There we go. So I want to begin by highlighting the variation in abortion policy that we have seen in the region from the early 2000s up until today. So what we see here is while abortion policy remained in status quo in many countries, these are the ones that are not marked by a particular color. There was also quite a lot of variation in terms of the direction of change in those countries that did reform their policies. So most noticeable here is the liberalization of abortion in the Southern Cone, where Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay decriminalized or otherwise liberalized their policies. At the same time, we see restrictions, particularly in Central America, where El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Honduras enacted restrictive change. But there are also cases where we see both liberalizing and restrictive change, for example, in Mexico. So Mexico's variation in abortion policy largely mirrors this regional pattern and captures the larger trend of reforms that go in different directions. So in federal Mexico, each state has jurisdiction over the penal codes that determine abortion policy, which has given way to significant variation across its 32 states. In particular, this landscape changed following Mexico City's decriminalization of abortion in 2007, which ushered in a flurry of restrictive reforms in the shape of constitutional amendments that established the right to life, which you can see here in red. So between 2008 and 2015, 17 states adopted these restrictive amendments that undermined existing provisions and made the legal status of abortion unclear. So in my book project, I examined this subnational variation to try to understand what determined policy reform and the direction of change across the Mexican states that shared dominant political and religious institutions as well as general culture. So what explains Mexico's subnational variation? So I argue that 2 main factors, party competition and the strength of religious institutions, shape the prospects for and the direction of policy reform. So more specifically, I find that the intensity of electoral competition and the ideological positions of party rivals interact with the strength of Catholic Church hierarchies in a given state to compel parties to pursue policy reform. So party competitions determined the extent to which incumbents or strong opposition parties need clergy support. In context of a strong church, that is a church that not only has a large number of followers and the institutional resources to mobilize them, but also has links to political and economic elites. Aligning party positions with Catholic doctrine can provide not only legitimizing support, but also access to business elites that are critical for effective governance, as well as the vote of religious constituencies, the confessional vote. But the extent to which these factors actually shape policy positions also depend on party type. So programmatic parties are constrained by their ideological statutes and they cannot really deviate much from those, whereas non-programmatic parties such as Mexico's PRI can take on a variety of positions depending on what might most benefit the party at a given time. Social movement pressure also influences party positions on abortion, and I'm sure Cora is going to talk extensively about this. So in Mexico, what I found was that while progressive feminist movements tended to mobilize strongly in Mexico City and could influence party strategies in a liberal direction in the capital, in more rural contexts where the church was stronger, conservative religious movements that we often now call anti-gender movements, they often overpowered liberal organizing, and their connections to clergy gave them political weight that led some parties to support restrictive reforms. But so where are we today? So although the wave of right to life amendments subsided after 2015, variation at the subnational level has continued in Mexico up until today. So following the footsteps of Mexico City, 3 additional states have decriminalized abortion: Hidalgo, Oaxaca, and Veracruz. And I argue that these reforms can be attributed to the factors that I just mentioned, and in particular, changes in party dynamics, as well as the weakness of the church in these states. So in these 3 states, they all had a majority of representatives that belonged to Morena, López Obrador's party that defines itself as left-wing and is relatively new on the party political scene. And in all of these 3 states, Morena was the party that introduced and successfully passed reform. I would argue that Morena's entrance into party politics in Mexico has changed reform dynamics, especially in states where the PRI and the PAN used to dominate, which has then ushered in a shift in which old alliances, especially between the PRI and Catholic Church elites, appear to have become less significant and are possibly replaced by new configurations of actors. So what we see in the case of Morena, for example, is that it has few ties to the church and seems to have little fear of its hierarchies. But I also want to emphasize here that I think that this shift might also be due to a growing evangelical influence in which party linkages to religious institutions are being reconfigured. At the same time, I want to be cautious to not overemphasize the impact of evangelical churches in Mexico, as their influence has not been as prominent in the country as it has elsewhere in the region. So according to INEGI's statistics, the number of citizens that are affiliated with evangelical churches or identify as evangelical has grown with about 3.7% over the last 10 years in Mexico. So those were some developments in terms of subnational politics, but we also see some large, important changes at the national level in Mexico, especially over these past few weeks. So in early September, the Supreme Court ruled that it's unconstitutional to criminalize abortion, which means that state constitutions that penalize the procedure should remove their criminal charges, and it will no longer be possible to prosecute women for having abortions, which has also been a big issue in Mexico. So obviously this is a major advance for reproductive rights, but it's important here to note that the ruling does not automatically decriminalize abortion in all Mexican states. Rather, it only struck down the state of Coahuila's law that penalized abortion with 3 years in prison. And what the ruling actually does is to set a binding precedent for judges that can then be used to challenge other state policies that criminalize abortion. So as I said, while this verdict is indeed very positive for reproductive rights in Mexico, as are the recent subnational policy liberalizations, there are reasons to be only cautiously optimistic about the future. So first, the elite networks that include PRI, PAN, and church hierarchies are still strong in many parts of the country. And my research shows that they tend to protect each other's interests in maintaining power. And as long as these alliances remain intact, I don't expect more than a handful of additional states to decriminalize abortion. And in the aftermath of the Supreme Court verdict, the big question is whether states will comply and actually go ahead and decriminalize abortion. So in 2015, the Supreme Court ruled that prohibiting same-sex marriage was unconstitutional. But even after that verdict, it took a couple of years before states began to enact change and remove their criminal clauses. And in several cases, these were achieved through amparos, or constitutional appeals. So in the case of abortion, the same might happen, which means that it can take years before it's actually criminalized in most of Mexico. Another big challenge is that, as we are all aware, Latin America's growing anti-gender ideology movement also operates in Mexico and has significant resources at hand. And I expect those opposing the recent court verdict to try to pursue some kind of a counter reform. And the main question is how this potential backlash will manifest. So which institutional pathways and government levels that opponents will use. And the key issue that these actors might be facing is that they are running out of legal strategies. So these right to life amendments that were previously used to restrict abortion in Mexico, they were also struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. And I expect it to require some creativity to come up with ways to undermine existing policies while also not violating the court verdict. So putting this in a regional perspective, what can we learn from Mexico regarding the future of abortion policy in Latin America? So there are a couple of developments I would like to highlight here. First is that a change in party dynamics matter for the prospects of policy reform, especially if it involves competition with a new or emerging party. And of course, other factors will also matter here, such as the ideological leanings of that new party. Second is the role of courts and the increasing judicialization of issues such as abortion. This is not new. So scholars have highlighted the role of judicialization over the past few years, also in relation to same-sex marriage. And I believe that the role of courts in solving these issues will continue, but it might also trigger counter reforms. And as we see stronger feminist mobilization in the region, especially in favor of abortion or liberalization of abortion, I think we can also expect stronger coalitions among conservative religious actors, which is already visible in many countries. So as scholars have pointed out, new forms of conservatism in Latin America have produced alliances, previously unthinkable alliances, between evangelical and Catholic sectors. And these sectors will try to hinder future policy liberalizations. So as we see this strengthened conservative religious front meeting a growing progressive movement, I think there is a danger of even more polarization over abortion. So what's my verdict then? So is Argentina an outlier or a pioneer, as per the theme of this panel? And here I think it's important to differentiate between the institutions that have the powers to change policy. So in terms of change enacted via the legislature, I do think Argentina is an outlier. And I think it might take a long time before we see another Latin American Congress voting in favor of abortion decriminalization. So while we have seen important change in other countries, much of that change has come through the courts. For example, now, most recently in Mexico. And I think the courts are a more likely venue for major liberalizing change in the future. Thank you. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now.
Thanks, Camilla. That was great and totally on time. Our second speaker is Nora Anderson Fernandez, sorry.
Hi, thanks everybody for coming here, and thanks for having me today. So I'm not going to start with slides. If I have time, I have some that I would share like in the middle of the presentation. So we'll see how it goes. So I will focus my presentation on the case of Argentina, especially since the legalization happened very recently, just end of last year. So To give you some context, until the recent legalization in Argentina was ruled by a 1920s article from the criminal code that allowed abortion only when the life and health of the woman was at risk and in cases of rape. And in December of 2020, a new law replaced this article, granting the right to have an abortion on demand up to 14 weeks and allowing the previous exceptions after this period of time. So it took a long time since the beginning of the campaign to legalize abortion in 2005 for this to succeed in Argentina. In the book I published last year, I analyzed why there was no abortion reform during the pink tide period in Argentina, during those three Kirchnerist administrations from 2003 until 2015, that advanced actually many areas of sexual and reproductive rights, but not abortion. And in an article I have now under review, I really explained the recent legalization and what changed, between these years that allowed for the legalization to happen last year. So in today's presentation, I want to, combine a little bit of my work in the book and in this article and do two things. First, center the movement as the main force behind legalization, the campaign for safe, free and legal abortion. I argue that the emergence of a strong social movement around abortion reform was able to shift the negative perceptions associated with this practice and build a multi-party coalition to advance legalization in Congress, in the case of Argentina. And the second thing I want to do is also challenge this idea that it was the role of the executive support the main explanatory variable of the case of Argentina. So although executive support coming from the current president, Alberto Fernandez, facilitated this process, it was not really sufficient on its own to achieve reform. And I will explain the reasons why, but his political will to support legalization was actually a reflection of the specific societal context that Argentina was going through, and his support was subordinated to actually my main variable, that is the movement's strength. He only supported abortion reform during his electoral campaign because of the show of strength the movement had displayed since 2018 and the green tide, as it is called, that was taking place in Argentina. So for me, the pivotal moment, the change happened really in 2018. Even though that bill that I will tell a little bit of the story was not successful in Congress, but that was the key event that then will anticipate the actual legal change that took place in 2020. So to provide a little bit of background of the evolution of the case for those that are not familiar with, let me just explain some of the events, and then I'll go back to my argument on the main variables and how they change in these two periods. From 2003 to 2015, there were, three administrations, first under Nestor Kirchner, then Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, that were in power. The movement for abortion reform was just launched in 2005, so during this period of the pink tide. And it only started growing towards what we know the movement to be now towards the end of this period, starting in 2015. The party system in Argentina, really with its low institutionalization, and I'm going to go into more detail in a little bit about that, and the lack of a clear, strong left-wing party, such as, when we see the case of Uruguay of the Frente Amplio, really made, relationships between the movement and politicians in power much harder. And to this, we add, the opposition to abortion reform that came from Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner and how it resulted in her own legislators almost self-censoring themselves. And they stated publicly that they were not introducing the bill that the movement have drafted because they knew that without executive support, it was really not going to be successful. So towards the end of the pink tide in 2015, we see in Argentina the emergence of a new movement, that of Ni Una Menos, the movement against femicide, that really starts expanding the horizons of feminism. We begin to hear feminist arguments in the mainstream media, mainstream politicians talk about it in the dinner table, and it's really the beginning of this feminist revolution that is coming, and that I think the Southern Cone is really at the vanguard within Latin America, and that will bring, the abortion reform also to the center of that feminist agenda. There's actually a good article by Davy and Mosley that discusses relationship between Ni Una Menos and the movement for abortion reform, like very, very, very successfully. But at the same time that this feminist movement is growing, we see the change in the administration that will be in power with Kirchnerism, losing those elections in 2015, and the Macri administration, this center-right alliance coming to power. But the movement for abortion reform, the campaign, grows so much throughout those years that in 2018, it is so strong that it really is able to impose the topic of abortion and introduce it into the legislative agenda. And I quote, President Macri at the time saying, "I am pro-life, but I am in favor of having an open discussion about this in Congress." So he placed no restriction and gave like a green light for the discussion to happen. And it's the first time that the bill that had been drafted by the campaign, by the social movement, enters the congressional agenda. It has been introduced many times, but it was never discussed until this year of 2018. This debate had no precedence. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, if you watch any of the congressional sessions, but it was one of the most debated bills in history. There were more than 700 presentations from civil society. People were following the debate on YouTube. It was an unavoidable topic if you were in Argentina. And even for those that are Argentinians like me from abroad, we were following it very closely. The movement was in the street constantly throughout this period, worked together with legislators, particularly in the lower chamber to advance this bill. They were starting to build this multi-party coalition to advance this legislation, and they succeeded in the lower chamber. And in June, the bill is approved in this chamber, but later goes to the Senate in August, and it is voted down, and it loses just by 7 votes, which still, it was quite a success for the change and how fast it had happened. And this collaboration that we saw between the movement and legislators in the lower chamber was not present in the Senate. The movement actually was prevented from interfering in these discussions and was sent away when the bill was in the Senate. So, however, it was clear at that time, and this is something that activists repeatedly stated, that society had already decriminalized abortion, that it was a matter of time that the laws will reflect, people's perception and approval of abortion reform at the time. So that shift that had happened in 2018, and we couldn't tell when in particular, but we knew that at most in the next 5 years after 2018, it would happen, and it did. It happened in 2020. So activists and analysts like me were not wrong of what was going to happen. So in this context of this large green tide, in 2019, Alberto Fernandez, the Kirchnerist candidate of this new coalition that is created, Frente de Todos, to oppose and defeat Mauricio Macri coalition, for the first time, a presidential candidate, Alberto Fernandez, expresses his support for abortion reform during the campaign. When he's elected, he expresses his commitment to fulfill this campaign promise and states he will introduce his own bill, so it's going to be a government bill, not the one from the campaign, to legalize abortion by March. Due to the pandemic and the lockdown that Argentina went through, the times were delayed, so the bill is finally introduced in November and passed in both chambers by December, actually 29 of 2020. So let's now analyze these main variables that I want to bring to the discussion to understand, this succession of events. So the first one that I'm focusing on is a movement strength and how, it really changed from those 3 Kirchner administrations of the pink tide into, going through the administration of Mauricio Macri and later to the Alberto Fernandez administration. So the 2015 growth of feminism really marked a key event in which the abortion reform movement could cling to this wave and begin growing exponentially. In my book, I define movement strength looking at several indicators. So I look at number of organizations of the campaign, the number of demonstrators and numbers of protests, the support from key social actors like judicial actors, like doctors' associations, unions, the visibility that the campaign had in the media, the public opinion support, and the increase in every single one of these dimensions, is clear throughout, starting in 2015 and really exploding in 2018. So I'm willing to show, more details about, those indicators if then there's a question. But the key element, I think, is how the movement took this strength and pushed for a particular strategy that was that of building a multi-party coalition for abortion reform. And for this, I need to briefly explain Argentinian's party system. So unlike the case of Uruguay, that was first to legalize abortion in 2012, in which Uruguay has a programmatic, highly institutionalized party system, which there's a clear, strong left-wing party that actually has roots in society. So it has institutional channels to connect with social movements. So it was very easy to the movement to find who to work with, create those links throughout the years, and then, work together and to pass, the legalization of abortion in Congress. Argentina actually has a low institutionalized party system with parties like the Peronist Party that actually, are placed within the whole ideological spectrum. We have Peronisms on the left, on the right, on the center. And that making it much harder, for activists from the movement to know, okay, who am I working with, except for the small left-wing parties, but that they don't have enough strong presence in Congress to really advance and introduce topics in the agenda. So, however, with this difficulties and obstacles, activists really understood the system, the party system, and realized that they could take advantage of the fact that all parties actually were divided around the issue of abortion. So they began building this multi-party coalition, which was definitely much harder. It took much longer. And that's why, there's all those years, around 15 years of struggling to push for this, this item to be discussed in the agenda. And they only made it in 2018. But at the same time, this multi-party coalition gave them much more autonomy from the political parties on their own, and it allowed them to advance their cause both under the Macri administration and the Alberto Fernandez administration. Coming from like very different perspectives in a particularly highly polarized political system like the one we have, with the Grieta in Argentina. This is probably one of the few issues in which, legislators from both sides of the Grieta, of this rift, were collaborating and voting across. So how were they able to do this? Again, I come back, to movement strength. They were not able to do this in 2010, in 2015. They had to wait until, the movement was large enough to actually be capable of mobilizing more than 1 million people in the streets so that the politicians will pay attention to what is happening here. So it wouldn't have been possible in the early years of the movement. And second, they were able, to build this multi-party coalition because of the absence of religious parties in Argentina. So the secular characters of all parties allow them to actually, be divided on this issue and not have like a principled definition of how do we stand around abortion. And it also allowed the presence of feminists in every single party that will actually be the ones that will advance this topic within their parties and become the key collaborators for the movement within, all these different parties. So that in terms of, why the movement has been the main driver. And I want to also address this alternative hypothesis that it could have been executive preferences that have driven, the main change of policy in Argentina. So, if you actually look at, during the pink tide, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner was really opposing abortion reform. And later we have Alberto Fernandez that is supportive, and reform happened under him. It's quite, a feasible hypothesis to have. But if we go and analyze more in detail, the vote and how many votes was Alberto Fernandez able to gain for the cause, really it shows that, again, that key shift happened in 2018. And, that Alberto Fernandez was a consequence of that, coming in support was a consequence of that main shift. So just to, point some. Do I have time to share some of my slides? Do you think so?
So you're running up on the limit.
Okay. So maybe I'll just
quickly.
Yeah, well, I can just mention it, and then if somebody wants to really break the vote and see how many votes were gained due to Alberto Fernandez, we can look into it, into the questions. So given that I said abortion divided all political parties, it also divided the Frente de Todos, Alberto Fernandez party. So his party alone was not able to pass reform. He could not discipline his whole party to vote in favor. Even his jefe de bancada, the chief in the Senate of the Frente de Todos, voted against abortion reform. So the multi-party coalition and the votes of across, the opposition were necessary. And there were, and I can show you a little bit of the breakdown, 34 votes were needed in the Senate to pass the bill. Frente de Todos had 38 senators, but not all of them voted in favor. So only 25 voted in favor. So that's clearly, not enough to get to the 34. And finally, his support did not provide more than 2 to 4 votes in the Senate. So there were 25 votes in favor of abortion coming from the Frente de Todos in the Senate. 22 of those had been senators that have already voted in favor of in 2018, or that had publicly expressed their support for legal abortion before. So that really shows that his influence was key. There's evidence in 2 cases. There's 2 senators that flipped, that had expressed publicly their opposition to abortion, and after meeting with President Fernandez, they ended up voting in favor, and 2 others that it's uncertain if they shifted because of Fernandez position or not. But clearly, out of those 25, he was at least influential either in 2 or 4. So really, I think pointing back to the fact that the key shift happened in 2018. So if I have 1 more minute, I can just reflect on what does this mean, for the rest of Latin America. Well, I think definitely, it puts movements at the center of this narrative of what happened in Argentina. So, that balance that Camilla was mentioning between who is stronger, either the feminist movements or those anti-gender movements, will be key in determining what will happen in terms of legalizing abortion in other countries. And then I think the issue of how the movement took advantage of the particular party system in Argentina is relevant, because the other example that we had before was Uruguay, with a highly institutionalized party system, with a strong left-wing party, which has been ideal for movements to work with, but that doesn't exist in most of the Latin American countries. I think that Argentina's more chaotic and less institutionalized party system, is more similar to other countries across Latin America than that of Uruguay. That seems more of an outlier. So I think it really shows that, despite the fact that a party system might make, the progress to advance this kind of issues for movements easier, they are not a complete obstacle, and it is possible to work through a party that is much more complex as such of Argentina, and this creating, for example, this multi-party coalition. And then the final thing is how we need to contextualize executive preferences and not take them as isolated variables, but really try to understand them in the relationship of what is happening at the movement level and at the society level of what do they think around abortion reform. So I think I'm going to stop there, and then I can continue in the Q&A part. Thank you.
Thanks, Cora. That was great. Our third speaker is Jocelyn Viterna from Harvard.
All right, I'm trying to get my slides set up here. There. I can see the slides now, but sometimes I hear people say that they're not advancing when I think they're advancing. And so please don't anyone hesitate to interrupt me if things seem to be stalled. So first I wanted to say thank you to the other panelists and to everybody who is here. I was just peeking at the participants list, and I'm awed by some of the intellectual power on that list. And I think people who can do a better job than me on this panel. So I'm going to try and give a kind of an overarching understanding of what's happening in El Salvador. But if anybody wants more specifics and more of the nitty-gritty, please don't hesitate to let me know, either in the Q&A or after the talk. I also wanted to say a particular thanks to Camilla for giving kind of the overview of what's happening in the region, because as scholars, as social scientists in particular, we tend to look at gender-based rights in the world and acknowledge that they're generally moving in a liberalizing direction. And a lot of the studies tend to ask sort of, has a country liberalized or not? And I think that not actually confounds a couple of variables. So some countries are liberalizing, others are not, but within that not, some countries are just stagnating and other countries are actually seeing a rights reversal. El Salvador is definitely an example of that. We've seen this with Poland and other countries as well recently. But just to point out, the Human Rights Campaign recently put out a press release that said 2021 is the worst year in recent history for LGBTQ legislative attacks in the United States, and a number of organizations called including the Washington Post, have recently run articles about the beginning of the end of Roe v. Wade in the US. And so I think there's a real question about whether we're seeing gender-based rights reversal happening here as well. So after we started out, or after we had some really positive insights from the first two cases, I'm going to take you to El Salvador, where things have actually been moving in a different direction. And to start out, I'm sure most of you know, El Salvador was embroiled in a intensive civil conflict from 1980 to 1992. And in 1992, there was a United Nations brokered peace treaties that set up the first democratic elections in the nation in 1994. So when I was trying to study the abortion movement in El Salvador, one of the first things I wanted to look at was, where did this abortion movement come from? Where did it start? And so I went and I examined about 25 years of archives in terms of newspaper articles, various sorts of media, legislative assembly notes, these types of things. And one of the things that really surprised me was that prior to 1992, I did not find anyone talking about abortion in El Salvador. Even the sort of political right was more interested in promoting population control policies and expanding birth control access. And it was not talking about abortion at the time. The first time I see abortion come into the sort of the political narrative was in 1992, and it really wasn't picked up until late 1993 and into the 1994 election. And at this time, a couple of things happened. One, the United Nations was hosting its population conference in Cairo, the 1994 conference. And Pope John Paul II became very he was very involved in speaking out against this conference, and particularly the notion that the global North was trying to control the number of sort of poor brown people in the global South through things like birth control and abortion. That was happening in 1994. At the same time, in the United States, we have the Republican Party. This is the year that Newt Gingrich launched his Contract for America plan. And this is the first year that there was some real strategic discussion about building abortion as a wedge issue with the right. And these two forces actually appear to me to have exported the abortion narrative to El Salvador. Specifically, one of the most powerful economic and political people in El Salvador was listed as the ambassador to the Holy See and became friends with the Pope during this time. And we also see very specific sort of adopting of US anti-abortion language coming up a few days later directly in the language in El Salvador. And so I won't go into this now, but I just think it's important that we sometimes tend to talk about what's happening in El Salvador as if El Salvador is sort of this uncivilized, barbaric country that lets women die instead of giving them life-saving abortions. But I think it's important to recognize that this was not an issue in abortion until there were these external forces that seemed to sort of export this narrative to El Salvador. And for the political right in El Salvador, it proved to be incredibly powerful in terms of winning them votes. And so you start to see changes in the criminal code every time there's an election that comes up. The right brings up this issue because it wins them votes. So at the next legislative elections in 1997, the party of the right really pushed a change to the criminal code that took away all the sort of abortion exceptions in the current criminal code and banned abortion in every situation. At the next presidential election in 1999, this party of the right decided that it would ensure that that criminal code was really difficult to change. And so it passed a constitutional amendment defining life as beginning at the moment of conception. And shortly thereafter, I start to see documentation, particularly through interviews with doctors and the like, that women stopped receiving obstetric care that they needed in hospitals. And within a few years, we start to see an increase in the number of women who are incarcerated for obstetric emergencies, often with 25 and 30-year sentences. So I've collected a lot of public opinion data about this, just asking every kind of group of Salvadorans I can find what they think about abortion. But I also really have dug into this question of what's happening legally with these cases. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the legal aspect, and then I'm going to talk about the medical aspects if I have time. And I started my watch. There we go. So I found about 90 court cases that I've gotten. You can see in the upper left-hand corner there, that's what each case is about 500 pages and has forensic documents and police reports and prosecutor arguments and the like. I've done life stories with the women who've been imprisoned, the archival evidence I talked to, and I've also just interviewed anyone that I can find, from forensic experts to attorneys on both sides of the issue to activists, journalists, politicians, and the like, and a lot of doctors. And just to show you the difference, prior to the passage of these laws, I found this newspaper article in one of the major newspapers in El Salvador that came out in 1991. And the story is basically that this woman, Maria Virtud Garcia, was in her 9th month, very far along in her pregnancy. She started feeling birth pains, or she started feeling abdominal pains, and she thought she had to go to the bathroom. So she went to the latrine outside her house and went to move her bowels, and instead felt the baby come out. She immediately called for help, and the neighbors came, and the Salvadoran Red Cross came, and it took hours, but eventually they were able to get the baby out. The baby was still alive, and although it was suffering from sepsis and some other problems from the fall, he ended up being fine, and it ended up being sort of a human interest story. Nobody talked about prosecution, nobody talked about any problems. But now let's go ahead to what happened after this law. Remember, 1997, the law passed. 1999, the constitutional amendment passed. And in 2001, we see the case of Mirna. I should have blocked out her name. Mirna's given me permission to use her case, but anyway, Mirna was a woman who had been married for about 14 years. And she had had a number of miscarriages and difficult pregnancies up until this time. When she realized she was pregnant again, she decided that she wasn't going to tell a lot of people because she was afraid the pregnancy wouldn't last. And she had had a lot of bleeding and difficulties throughout the pregnancy. When she was, what she anticipates was about 7 months pregnant, she felt abdominal pains. She went to use the latrine thinking that that was the cause of the abdominal pains. And just like the previous case, she felt something fall from her body. She went and got help from her neighbors. The neighbors were able to, the neighbors called the police, but in the meantime, they were able to get the baby out of the latrine, and the baby ended up being absolutely fine. I think I have a picture. This is Mirna on the left with the baby who was born in the latrine in the middle. It could have been another one of those sort of human interest stories. But in this case, one of the neighbors started talking about how Mirna likely threw the baby in the latrine because her husband was sterile and she didn't want her husband to know that she must have gotten pregnant by somebody else, which of course there was absolutely no evidence of that. And the police came and they started talking about how in El Salvador, we understand that life begins from the moment of conception. And so they ended up arresting Mirna. Mirna went through a trial that started out being accused of abortion. But in the process of the trial, it became clear that she had not done anything to sort of intentionally interrupt a pregnancy, which is sort of the definition of abortion, although abortion is not defined in the law in El Salvador. But rather than dropping the case, they actually upgraded the charge to attempted aggravated homicide. And Mirna was found guilty of that, and she was sentenced to 12.5 years in prison, and she served all 12.5 years of those, all of those 12.5 years. We actually were able to get her case overturned but only after she had spent all those years in prison. So the question then is sort of what happened. You know, on the one hand, these laws were passed, but on the other hand, abortion laws in other countries are not typically heavily enforced. So what made this different? I am so out of time already. So basically, one thing I found is that we saw this huge push in the media that said, you know, we have to actually pay attention to protecting the unborn. And it's not just enough to pass these laws, but we actually have to find these women and convict them. You can see here, the article on the left actually talks about all these babies that get thrown away into latrines. The article on the right says mothers converted into assassins and histories of stone cold hearts. And the thing at the bottom actually says something along the lines of, they were human beings who were spent the first 9 months in the warmth of their mother's womb. And upon birth, they were awaiting the sweet hands of their mother, but instead they encountered the talons of soulless women, right? So there was this real negative messaging that came out against these women that I think took care of this. So I won't talk about the other case, except to say that you start to see that it's this girl who looks like she's about 12 here, and her baby was also born into the latrine. This case just happened in 2019. So it's still going on, and you start to see all of these kinds of similar arguments that come up in the court cases where they use really perverted sort of forensic understandings and really biased gendered narratives about parenthood to argue that these women, even if it was an obstetrical emergency, even if it wasn't necessarily something that was premeditated, the reality is that abortion begins at, or life begins at conception in El Salvador. And if life begins at conception, then it's really hard to tell the difference, if legal life begins at conception, between abortion and murder, right? Like there's especially when abortion has no definition in the law. I might also point out that El Salvador has sort of it has an accomplice law, which is very similar to the aiding and abetting law that was just passed in Texas, which also makes doctors very hesitant to support women with abortions or to not report them if they think there's anything unusual that happened with an abortion case. So finally, in the process of talking to all these doctors through these women's cases, the doctor said, look, you really have to come study what's happening in the hospital too, because the doctors really feel a huge cost on themselves from the trauma of, you know, trying to support patients in medical crisis when they know they could end that medical crisis, but they fear doing so might cost them their freedom or their job, and the anxiety of not knowing if one of your colleagues might report you as an accomplice or an abortionist. And so between the interviews with the doctors, we've also gotten permission to do some different chart reviews to see what happens, for example, if a woman has a pregnancy where the fetus has an abnormality that is incompatible with life after birth. And in most countries in the world, even the strict abortion companies, they would let women interrupt that pregnancy because that was not a viable pregnancy ever. But in the in El Salvador, they do require these women to carry those pregnancies to term. And we're finding that it causes pretty incredible harm to their bodies, even if it doesn't threaten their lives. Women are losing their uteruses, they're getting sort of deformed aspects of their genitalia because they had to carry these difficult cases to term. So other cases where women had cardiac problems and they were unable to get the abortion they needed and they ended up dying. And of course, the fetus in their womb died as well. And even things like ectopic pregnancies, medical officials will typically delay operating on someone with an ectopic pregnancy until they can no longer detect cardiac activity in the embryo, even if that means they delay so long that a fallopian tube explodes. So real powerful health consequences as well. So I hate to end on a downer note, but I'll end there to say that I think we have these really interesting competing forces going on in Latin America and throughout the world, and that we have, the powerful feminist pro-choice movement, but we also have a very powerful movement that calls itself the pro-family movement, that's anti-LGBTQ, anti-abortion rights. And in the places where that powerful pro-family movement has taken control, we're starting to see some pretty provocative rights reversals in relation to gender. Thank you.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Thanks to all three. We now have a pretty good chunk of time for Q&A. So, and we've got half a dozen great questions in the queue. So let me try to at least throw some of them out to you, and hopefully we'll get to a couple of rounds. So I'll ask a few questions. Some of them are for the group, some of them are targeted, and just take up the ones that you're best able to pick up. Don't feel obligated to take up every single question. And if you could maybe take around 3 minutes in your responses, that would be great. So let me see if I can organize these. One question comes from June Ehrlich and has to do with electoral politics. And if I can just build on that a little bit, at the risk of sounding like an old modernization theorist, economic development, modernization, secularization should create a constituency, a larger constituency for pro-abortion politicians. In the old days, it was a no-brainer that elected politicians would be anti-abortion in Latin America. Now it's not so clear. And so June's question is, how do politicians balance, on the one hand, sort of abortion rights constituencies against conservative Catholic constituencies? And if I could just tack onto that, Camilla, you said Argentina, which is a case of sort of party-led reform, is an outlier, and that we're more likely to see liberalization occur through the courts. And my building on June is, why is that the case? Why are we not seeing more of an electoral-driven incentive for liberalization? Okay, a second question, I guess, is targeted to Camilla. Argentina saw a link. I can't remember if it was actually Cora or Camilla who mentioned that there was a link between the Ni Una Menos movement and abortion liberalization. Was it you, Cora? So the question is whether such a link might exist in Mexico with the anti-femicide movement that we've seen in recent years. Might that provide an impetus for the anti-abortion movement as well, or is there not a relationship? And is AMLO's relative conservatism an obstacle to that happening in Mexico? Another attendee asked a big, difficult, but I think important question about the old sort of chicken and egg question about cultural change and policy change. And in the case of abortion, meaning what can we say based on the cases that we know, either in the Southern Cone or Mexico, about what comes first? Is it that the cultural change that brings about the policy change, or vice versa? Cora, there's a question on the main opponents, the main members of the opposition coalition in 2008, and whether that coalition changed or was somehow weakened between 2018 and 2020. There's also a vaguely related question about how the global conservative or global Catholic movement responded to the Argentine case under the watch of an Argentine pope. Did he receive blame for that within the global Catholic movement? There's a question about public opinion. Cora makes the argument that public opinion was pretty important in Argentina, and so the question is directed to Camilla, which is, what's been the role of public opinion in the Mexican case? What can we say? And finally, I'll throw one more out there, which is a question about the role of transnational actors, particularly conservative actors based in the United States, the conservative movement, the Republican Party in the United States, and what impact that they have had on anti-abortion movements in Argentina and Mexico, El Salvador. So the questions for all three of you. All in 3 minutes. Thanks, guys. Why don't we just go in the same order that you presented?
Okay, so that's a lot of questions. Okay, let's start with public opinion. This is a factor that very often comes up when we talk about abortion politics in Latin America. And I think the reason why that is that we have this idea that primarily or predominantly Catholic population must be against abortion. In my research in Mexico, I have not found much evidence of public opinion mattering. I think from the party political perspective, I think many parties do believe that they might be punished if they are liberalizing abortion, but that only pertains to those very few parties that have only the PRD actually before Morena entered the stage in Mexico. And overall, what I have found is that PAN and the PRI that have been dominating the subnational arena for very long have not really cared much about public opinion. In fact, there is very little public opinion research at the subnational level in Mexico. So we largely don't even know what regular citizens think. The only survey that has been carried out, actually, as far as I know, was ahead of Mexico City's decriminalization in 2007. What I found is largely that this is about elite alliances. So in states where the PRI could profit off of their links to the church, they have been very reluctant to do anything, and they will not budge, not even in the face of some mobilization. But it's important to note here also that there has not been a lot of mobilization in favor of abortion, especially not in more rural contexts in Mexico. So we primarily see this in Mexico City. That said, I do think that is changing slightly. I do think that there is some kind of a cultural change going on. But again, I think when we're talking about mobilization and how that matters and whether that is changing not only party political strategies, but also the overall culture and perhaps then public opinion, it is really important to know that much of this is going on in Mexico City. In many other states, we really don't see mobilization. And it is really more conservative forces that are still operating. So moving on to the question about electoral politics that is now also kind of emerging with the question about López Obrador and the links between Ni Una Menos and the abortion movement, or the abortion, sort of the fight for liberal abortion policies in Mexico. I think for many, many years, many feminist activists or the movement at large were very reluctant to touch upon abortion. And when I've been interviewing activists in different states, many of them have said that, we can mobilize for violence against women, and we can mobilize strongly. But when it comes to abortion, there's been such a stigma. So that hasn't really taken place. I think we are seeing a shift now in Mexico City. And I do think that we are likely to see feminist activists in the national capital mobilizing more in favor of abortion. But I think that's all I can say at this moment. I haven't seen any direct evidence of that, but it is possible that there are links. In terms of AMLO and his receptiveness to the movement, I think we all know that AMLO and the feminist movement are not exactly on the same page at the moment. And he also is notorious for having such an ambivalent stance on abortion. So if we're talking about executive preferences, not thinking about what Cora was presenting, I do think that AMLO cannot be trusted to be pushing in a liberalizing direction. He has not done so when he's been leading other left parties. And there's a lot of speculation still about his sort of religious identity. So I think the closest wording in the get to executive preferences mattering here would be him saying that we're going to have a referendum on abortion, for example. At the same time, it is his party, Morena, that has been pushing for abortion liberalizations in several states. So there is this very ambivalent or perhaps conflictual issue going on there between party leadership and representatives in the different states. I think I am going over my time here. Do I still have a couple of seconds to say something more, Steve?
A couple of seconds.
Okay. So for the question of electoral politics, I think in my perspective, in the Mexican context, electoral politics matters very, very much. In particular, as I said previously, when it comes to non-programmatic parties like the PRI. So we see that in the capital, when the PRD was pushing for an abortion decriminalization back in 2007 and the years leading up to that, the PRI actually, it was their proposal in a modified version that actually passed. So when they were competing with the progressive PRD, they actually were in favor of abortion. But in the majority of other states where the PRI was competing with the conservative PAN, who is very much against abortion, the PRI was taking the lead in actually pushing for these right to life amendments. So at least in the Mexican context, I would say that electoral politics is very much part of abortion politics and policy that we see.
Great, thanks. You covered a lot in 3 minutes. Cora.
Okay, I'm gonna give my try. So I'm gonna start with the question about the chicken or the egg. And just like having studied the cases of the Southern Cone, I think I can clearly say that in at least in the case of Uruguay and Argentina, the cultural shift happened first, and then legalization, took place. I think definitely in Uruguay was clear, like for me, the question in Uruguay is like not when, why it happened, but like why didn't it happen earlier in such a, secular society? Like you would have expected like abortion to have been legalized before, but it still took a while until 2012. In Argentina, as I said, the shift was, if we, of course, these are like gradual changes, but like if we were to point to a year, as I said, 2018 was the shift that if you were living in Argentina, you could feel it. You didn't even need to check a public opinion to say how things have changed from some years. And having, been born and raised in that country, I was almost a little shocked about that sudden change in 2-3 years of how things change. And then, the law came like 2 years later. It didn't take that longer, but I think definitely like, society was ready for that change. In terms of the questions about electoral politics, yes, I do think that they matter a lot. And that's what I think also Camilla was saying in terms of how politicians kind of, I think, evaluate the balance between, okay, who's stronger, the Catholic Church and the evangelical coalitions, or, the feminist movements. Like in a way, in my research, what I found is that there's only like small groups of legislators or politicians, that are like convinced feminists or convinced anti-choicers, and the majority are like in the middle, kind of evaluate the political risk of going one side or the other. So that, balance between the movements will affect, how they will vote. And that's how we saw, changes. Like the biggest change in the case of Argentina was that, for example, of Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, that opposed abortion reform when she was a president. And then as a senator, she actually acknowledged, and she stated publicly, it's like the young women in the streets made me change my position of how, powerful that movement was for her to reassess her position. And she voted in 2018 when she was a senator in favor, and then also, was part of the administration that introduced the bill to legalize abortion. The other short comment about the anti-choice movement, definitely during 2018, they organized, there was also, some alliance between Catholic Church and the rising evangelicals. Evangelicals are not as powerful as in other maybe Central American countries or Brazil and Argentina, but, they are a rising force, and they have proposed some candidates to Congress. They don't have, like one big, party that supports them, but they have, placed some candidates here and there. And they, they were organizing. What is interesting is like that the Catholic Church, especially initially, when the discussion was happening in the lower chamber in 2018, they took a little bit of a backseat because they have been, they had like, some bad consequences from how active they had been in the same-sex marriage discussion in 2010, that they had been so upfront leading the opposition. So initially they took a back seat, but after the vote passed in favor of legalizing abortion in the lower chamber, they really shifted, and because they really didn't think that it was going to pass, basically. So that's why they were like more of a backseat, and evangelicals were more in the forefront. So there was a big change during June and August, that the vote is taken in the Senate in 2018, with the church really, regaining some leadership in organizing and mobilizing, Catholic schools and people in the streets. There's like the design of like either like the blue bandana that goes against like the green bandana. So a lot of also appropriating frames and strategies of the other side, and organizing much more in the streets. And definitely a lot of lobby to prevent the vote by passing in the Senate. So we see an activation. And then just a final comment, if I have one more minute. around Pope Francis. Definitely, I can say that in 2013, when Pope Francis was elected, there was like a Pope Francis effect of freezing anything around abortion in Argentina. There was like a craze to, like, we all want to, among politicians, we all want to take a picture with Pope Francis and be on his good side. But it didn't last that long. And it's clear that, you know, in 2018, one actually of the hypotheses of explaining why Mauricio Macri gives green light to the discussion of abortion in Congress was because of the constant criticizing of the Catholic Church of the neoliberal policies. So almost like the church, you know, that party had lost already the support of the church. So why not, you know, like what do we have to lose? And the other final comment is that because of the kind of position of being a more progressive Pope of Pope Francis, you know, being more on the left, he has started to be known as like the communist Pope. So that have also, you know, like generated less support for him among, you know, the more traditional conservative sectors. So there have been divisions within Catholics on how they perceive the Pope, and that had affected these discussions as well. Thank you.
I never cease to be amazed at what counts as communist these days in Latin America. Jocelyn.
Thank you, Steve and everyone. I'm going to take the questions on public opinion and culture versus policy kind of together. And if I have time, I'll touch on the transnational role of the pro-family movement. So I think in El Salvador, we had a bit of a perfect storm. When the first democratic elections were happening, the party of the right had to compete with the party of the left for the first time, and they didn't have policies that would attract, that would sort of address the issues of an impoverished population when the majority of the country was living in poverty. And so being able to sort of grab onto this abortion issue ended up working really well for them, and they rode that for a long period of time. So I think it really worked in El Salvador for a couple of reasons. One, although abortion had not been part of the political narrative prior to that, when the FMLN was documenting during the war, when they would document the abuses of the state army against the FMLN combatants, one of the regular stories that people told me in my interviews and that you see in congressional testimonies and the like was this story about how the soldiers would cut unborn babies out of women's bellies. And so I think even though the left is traditionally sort of associated with pro-choice movements, in this case, the left had long had a narrative about protecting unborn babies in this strange context. Secondly, when the elites started to pick this up, not only they were in a moment where sort of the global world was looking down on El Salvador for the human rights violations, particularly by this elite right-wing party. And this was a way that the Pope was formally congratulating individuals for standing up for the rights of the unborn in a global context, both in the 1994 and the 1995 UN conferences and so on and so forth. And so it was a way of sort of gaining global prestige in the elite's mind. Plus the elite controlled the media, they controlled the television, they controlled the newspapers, they, you know, would have fundraisers where they could actually raise money from foreign people trying to help them change the abortion law, and then they would fund that money to their right-wing politicians, who then of course would pass the laws that kept them in power anyway. But there's also a really interesting part of this, that when I would interview the people, the sort of the elite women who ran this pro-life movement in El Salvador, it was remarkable the kinds of disturbing classist narratives that came out sometimes, right? Like what we would imagine as a more of a racist or an ethnic taunt in the United States. But I had several doctors who were in favor of the anti-abortion law that I interviewed, who actually referred to, they compared sort of peasants' sexual proclivities to the way animals reproduce and things like that. So there's this real notion that we have to sort of have this paternalistic attitude towards the people who are poorer. And there's also, I think, important to note that people who have money in El Salvador never have a problem getting an abortion. They never have a problem getting the medical care they need, and they never go to jail. And I can tell you, it was astounding. Sometimes I would talk to these women and they would talk to me about this medical crisis they had that ultimately ended up in an abortion to save their lives. And I would say, but isn't it against the law? And they'd be like, no, not at all in my case, right? And they said, that's what happens everywhere. And I'd say, no, it doesn't. I talked to people in the public hospitals and they would actually let the woman die in that case. They're like, no, that's not true. Actually, it is. So there's this real class issue. And in terms of public opinion, when I would talk to people who were more in the impoverished area, peasants, cab drivers and stuff, I found huge support for anti-abortion legislation. The support tended to be more based on sort of misogynist notions against women than any urge to protect the fetus, right? It was sort of women should know better. But there was also a real misunderstanding about the effects of this law. So when I would say things like, if a person had an ectopic pregnancy, do you think they should interrupt the pregnancy and take out the embryo, or should they let the woman's fallopian tube explode? They'd be like, well, duh, of course you would interrupt it because there's no chance. And they were really shocked to learn that that was not the case. So public opinion in El Salvador, we do have pretty good data. It's still overwhelmingly in favor of the total abortion ban. But this is really driven by people who have power, who have money, who use this to stay in political power and to generate money for themselves from this transnational movement. And it seems to me to be largely misunderstood and based on really misogynist ideals among people who have less money. And yeah, the transnational the pro-family movement, I think we need a tremendous amount more of information on this. I think we actually are seeing collaboration between Catholic Church, evangelical church, far-right groups like the Proud Boys and more eugenics movements that really have this natalist version, as well as the religious right growing in various countries. And I don't think we fully understand that yet. And that's something I hope to do in the future.
Thanks. I now turn to Fran, who I think has a question.
I do. I want to pick up on one of the questions that has arrived in our chat, in our question and answer, and I want to build on it. So the question is whether reliance on a legal rights-based approach is actually the best way to ensure access to abortion in Latin America. And so I think that Jocelyn has given us a pretty powerful answer through her presentations about what I might call negative laws, that they actually have an impact. That a doctor in a hospital with a poor woman with an ectopic pregnancy, that woman might die because this law exists. But for all the emphasis on changing the law to allow greater access, is that the way to go? And sort of two background anecdotes I could add to this is, I remember Ruth, I think it was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but it was somebody who said the problem was that with the United States abortion law, as I'm listening to the stories about Latin America, I'm thinking about what the United States felt like 40 years ago and what it feels like now. And somebody said that the problem with Roe v. Wade was not the law, but that it got out in front of public opinion. And that's what generated all the backlash. That may not be empirically right, but that was a meme that wasn't a meme. This was in the days before social media, but this became a sort of a conventional wisdom in the United States. And so I don't know whether this is what Perla has in mind in this question, but it is a question. But my former colleague at Notre Dame, Christina Wolbrecht, who Cora might remember, who worked on gender and politics, women in politics, once opened her comments to a group of people talking about abortion in Latin America with the question, how much difference do you think the law makes? And she had empirical evidence on exactly how many abortions were performed in states that used to not allow abortion and those that were, and that basically people who were going to get abortions were going to get them, and people who, just because you had a law didn't mean that you were going to get access to abortion. So as your rich presentations have pointed out, the possibility for counter-mobilization, not just among evangelical groups or opportunistic parties, but the alliances that have allowed parties of the right to hold on to something that can capture popular votes when their economic proposals might not be all that popular. We've now flipped from cross-cutting to overlapping cleavages in these parties. This has become a tremendous electoral mobilizing force. it's not surprising to me that it's Argentina and Uruguay that have the most liberal abortion laws, because not only you don't have Catholics anymore, you don't have evangelicals anymore. I mean, you just don't have anybody who's going to oppose this anymore. But outside of those places, outside of that particular corner of the southern cone of Latin America, is this the right strategy? How much are we banking on the law to change a long, protracted fight? Is this the right way? As you look at the United States over the last 40 years and you project Latin America's future, what would your advice be? What would your goals be for Latin American social movements pushing for gender rights, for abortion rights?
In about a minute each.
I can start. No, definitely legal reform is not enough. And I think that's why in the cases that it comes with this cultural revolution that has been feminism revolution in the Southern Cone, it is ensuring that, you know, the values of the society are already changing. And you see it in the younger generations. It's a complete different mindset, you know, that I come from the generation in my 40s of how they view, like going back to public opinion among adolescents in the context of Argentina, it was like more than 80% were in favor of, you know, abortion reform, while like among the general population was more around 60, you know, depending on which survey you'll take. So I think that change, at least in the Southern Cone, is coming. You know, feminism is part of like an identity for many, you know, young women. It's just more than like abortion. It's just like they want to build like a new society with these feminist principles. And I think we see it even in Chile. Fran, just thinking, you know, how, again, like the Southern Cone is, I believe, at the vanguard of this feminist revolution. Like in Chile, what has happened in the last 2 to 3 years is unprecedented. And I have done research there like many years ago, 10 years ago, and I can't believe that that is the same society with having also, you know, such innovative spaces as Las Tesis, with, you know, like their campaign against sexual violence being, you know, present around the whole world, and now with the presence of feminist representatives to the Constitutional Convention, which I'm still, you know, following to see how much of a feminist imprint will be present. So I think, yes, I think that there is, you know, something beyond the law that is happening within Latin America. Maybe not in all the countries, but we can definitely see that pushing from the Southern Cone. And also, to answer the main question, I do think that Argentina is not an outlier, but like a trendsetter that will start, you know, sweeping the region, or at least, you know, that's like where we hope it will be.
Who's next?
Should I go, or Jocelyn, do you want to go first?
You're welcome to go, Camilla.
Okay. I think this is a very important and very difficult question. I mean, I agree largely with what Cora was saying. And sort of thinking about the future, what to avoid, as Fran was saying, I think that there are a couple of things. It's very clear that laws aren't enough. And thinking about the Mexican context, Mexico kind of is the prime example of a country that is enacting all these beautiful laws. But when it comes to implementation, there are huge gaps. So in many of these states that I was talking about that actually have decriminalized abortion, with the exception of Mexico City, it's been tremendously difficult for women to actually gain access regardless, because you have all of these bureaucrats that are against it, and there are all of these other types of loopholes. So of course, like ensuring that implementation is actually working is a major part of making abortion actually accessible for regular women and not just rich women. I think also that when we're talking about a controversial issue such as abortion in a conservative region, I think counter-mobilization will probably always be inevitable. I think there are always going to be groups that are against it. There's always going to be some kind of a backlash. And what could be a strategy? I'm not sure how feasible this is, but making sure that there aren't so many legal loopholes. So what we see in the US after Roe v. Wade, we saw all these states sort of trying to get around the liberalizing decision, right? Enacting either these kind of piecemeal legislation that was slowly undermining or chipping away at abortion rights. In Mexico City, we see this creative legal strategy of right to life amendments. So we see these counter forces coming up with ways to chip away at liberalizing laws, and finding ways to ensure that that doesn't happen is very difficult, but creating better laws and ensuring proper implementation, making sure that all the mechanisms are there to ensure that, I think would be the most important parts. Because again, I don't think when it comes to these kinds of controversial issues that we can avoid counter-mobilization, regardless of how secular or progressive the society is, because there's always going to be these very militant groups, if you will. So those are my 2 cents.
I love this question as well. And obviously, if I could snap my fingers and change the law in El Salvador, I'd do it, because I think having that law gives people support when they mobilize. That said, if you change the question slightly to say, what should people be mobilizing for? I'd probably have a different opinion. And I would probably say, I think the focus on the changing the law should come secondary to the focus on empowering women. I say this I have 5 points, so I'll try and go fast. First, Nicaragua passed the same law as El Salvador a few years after El Salvador, and yet even with the same law in the books and very similar geographies and political histories in Nicaragua, women do not die in hospitals and women do not go to jail for any sort of abortion-related crime, because the people in those positions do not enforce the law. And so I think that does show that there's a difference between passing the law and enforcing the law. Secondly, I sometimes get frustrated with the feminist movement in El Salvador when they are so focused on changing the law that sometimes they forget that sometimes they do their activism on the backs of the women who are the most vulnerable. Specifically, all of the women who I have been working with in jail, not a single one of them actually had an abortion. They didn't instigate an abortion. Every single one of them had some sort of an obstetrical emergency, maybe a placental abruption or something along those lines. And yet by pulling up these women's stories and tying them to the pro-choice movement, right? Saying these are the women's stories, are why we need to have abortion rights in El Salvador, it cemented in people's minds that these women actually had done something illegal. They had actually broken the law. And I can tell you, even the prosecutors I talked to was like, well, abortion's against the law. And I'd have to sit there and say, but they didn't have an abortion. And if you really wanted to get those women out of jail, like if that was your specific goal, mobilizing around the fact that they didn't have an abortion but suffered a medical emergency would have been the way to get them out of jail. It just wouldn't have been as effective for gaining money and support to change the law. I think it's important to note that elites don't want sexual education and advocate against that in El Salvador or feminist education. I think it's important to note that when I did talk to prosecutors, there was a tremendous lack of knowledge about gender and how it dealt with violence or reproduction in their cases. I remember in one case where a young woman had been raped systematically by her stepfather from the time she was 12 until she got pregnant by him at age 19. And when she finally pointed the finger at him, they were quick to throw her in jail for attempted aggravated homicide because she accidentally birthed the baby into the latrine because she didn't realize she was pregnant because she was psychologically traumatized and dealing with some disassociation. They were quick to throw her in jail, but when I asked them why it took 7 times that the lawyer put a demand against the stepfather before they would actually go arrest him, the prosecutor said, well, you know, what am I supposed to believe? This girl doesn't say anything for 7 years about the abuse, and then suddenly when she's in hot water, that only then does she point the finger, and the guy's sitting over there acting like he's innocent. Who am I going to believe? Of course the girl's making it up. And I'm sitting here thinking like, oh my God, we have so many studies that say 90% of children who suffer sexual assault never report it, right? And so just that basic fundamental understanding of gender, I think, would make a huge difference in these cases. So if I could change the law, absolutely. But if I really had to choose one or the other, I would figure out systems for protecting doctors, for protecting women, for providing abortion services to women who need it. I would have systems set up to be sending the abortion pill into Texas and having doctors on call for women who need them, right? I think, you know, there are ways to get around sort of the clinic Planned Parenthood notion we have in the United States. And if we got past that notion of trying to keep them in business, there might be other ways that we could actually better help pregnant people.
Okay, thanks, Jocelyn. I want to thank Camilla, Reuterswärd, Cora Fernandez, Jocelyn from Viterna. Great presentation. We really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your research and your insights. To the audience, please join us next week. We have a panel on populism in the courts in Latin America. And I should reiterate that Dr. Klaas is committed to gendered balance on our panels, and we're going to try hard to try to find a male panelist next week. Thanks, everybody. Have a good week.
Thank you.